Very good afternoon. Great to be here. In the June of 1914, a 19-year-old man who was a Bosnian Serb in Sarajevo, Bosnia, fired a bullet. And that bullet was the start of the First World War, which soon engulfed all of Europe, lasted 4 years, and resulted in the death of millions of people. Only 2 decades after that, another shot was fired. And this was from a German ship in the Polish port city of Gdansk. And that marked the beginning of the Second World War. This was when Hitler invaded Poland. This war lasted about 6 years. It was a devastating war. Millions of people were killed. And at the end of it, the world came to 1945. But yet another war began. And that lasted 45 years. This was the Cold War. It was a Cold War for Europe, but it was a very hot war for many other parts of the world. And among others who were impacted by this war were India. India's story in the last century also has been of multiple wars. India faced these wars, 4 wars with Pakistan, 1 war with another adversary, China. So the history of the 20th century was a story of much conflict. And this conflict was something that defined the 20th century in many ways. But was this the only story? And this is what we are going to be talking about, the war and peace. Were there only instincts of war, or were there also instincts for peace? So when the World War started and went on from 14 to 18, it was known as the war that would end all wars. It led to the first agreements, the Treaty of Versailles, and it led to an attempt by the world to find a solution with the League of Nations that came into being at the end of the First World War. Yes. So soon we had the Second World War, which was a conflict that devastated millions, but it also led to the creation of another organization, and that was the United Nations. It also led to other plans and an attempt to rebuild the world, to rebuild Europe at least through the Marshall Plan, and to create the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, and the IMF. So there was an attempt again to make peace. And the 20th century also saw the Cold War, which came in a period of tension, but there were many positives during this period. There was also the arms limitation talks, the SALT talks. There was much conversation around preventing nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was avoided. The whole attempt of the world was to avoid a nuclear conflagration. So for closer home for India, there were multiple other problems, and this was the battles that India fought with China, with Pakistan. But with each war, there was an instinct to try and create peace as well. So why do we fight? Why do human beings want to destroy each other? What is the alchemy of conflict? And there is one particular view in international relations, a realist view, which is this, that nations live in anarchy. There is no world government, so nations will behave in anarchic ways. They try to maximize their power, and they try to maximize the balance of power and try to maximize their national interest. And this essentially leads to a situation where through history, empires, nations have pursued power to dominate, to protect their interests, to expand their influence, and this pursuit has led to wars, invasions, imperialist expansions, and of course, human devastation. So there were multiple kinds of conflict that the world has seen. And it isn't just the 20th century. It was even earlier that we've seen wars. We in India are familiar with the epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana are stories. They tell the stories of great wars and great peace. And through a Western sensibility, there is the narration of wars from the 5th century BCs, the Greeks versus the Romans in the Peloponnesian Wars. They were essentially efforts at increasing or accumulating power and changing the power balance in their favor. Famously also, we had the 30-year war in Europe in the 17th century, which was fueled by a power struggle between major European powers. And we've also had the world wars, which we talked about. They stemmed from power struggles as well. World War I was from imperial rivalries, World War II from fascist expansionism, and the Cold War was a contestation between the US and the USSR for geopolitical dominance. When we talk of closer home, we've seen these conflicts in India, India against Pakistan, India against China, and essentially these are territorial disputes, animosities, and this war, and which we hoped to leave this conflict and contestation in the 20th century and move to a more enlightened 21st century, was a dream that was not fulfilled, because the 21st century, and even as we speak, has been a century where wars have not ended. We have the Ukraine war, which is essentially a rivalry between the NATO and Russia. And we've seen a war in West Asia, where multiple proxies are at work in wars that continue to this day. Okay, so I think the point here is that this talk is not about personal growth or the growth of the individual or even the growth of a business through incremental changes, but improvement in the relationship between countries. Now, is that possible also as Kaizen, as small steps that are continuous steps? So just as mankind has been at war, mankind needs to find those solutions to peace. The war is easier, the peace is much harder. It requires long-term effort, long-term vision, negotiation, perseverance. So building peace between nations requires a Kaizen of sorts, and that Kaizen is diplomacy. Because the diplomacy is the negotiation between countries that takes you away from your basic instinct. If the basic instinct of mankind is to be at war, to increase power, to accumulate power, then there is also, fortunately, another instinct, which is to build peace. But building that peace requires the patience, requires the incremental effort, which is much harder than having war. So if you look at the history of building peace and look at some of the wars we fought, the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, excuse me, that was the one which effectively ended the 30-year war in Europe. And that was a war, an effort at peace, which is seen as a pivotal moment in history. It took us to a stage where we could arrange ourselves to be sovereign states, sovereign nation states. We hoped that that would end the wars and bring us peace. It didn't quite happen that way, but at least it developed the principle of sovereignty, and it gave us the nation state that we so value today. We've seen much peace building after each crisis that the world faced. After the First World War, we had the League of Nations. After the Second World War, we established the United Nations. And after the Cold War, which ended in 1991, we tried to develop and moved from what was, after 1945, a bipolar order that gave a certain stability to the world. But when we moved from there to a unipolar order, and now we flounder in the 21st century looking for that answer for new order, which would be a multipolar order. So we have perhaps now developed the G20 to solve the economic challenges and the global problems that we face, but that is still not an adequate response. It is a response, but not adequate. If you see the history of peace building, it also comes from countries organizing themselves into communities. So you have the regional community of the European Union, you have the ASEAN to our east, and regional integration which promotes the kind of stability that we look for. One of the conversations we have is that if you look at France and Germany, where they were a couple of centuries ago, they were at war, they were in contests, but they developed into partners from the adversaries they were at the end of the war. If we look closer home, the India-Pakistan story is one of attempting peace, but yet not being able to do it for various structural reasons. So there were attempts with the SAARC, which was the South Asian Association of Organizations, and the countries tried regionalism, but to this day, they haven't got to the point of rapprochement where they can have a stable relationship, if not a normal relationship. So what is diplomacy? Why do we talk about diplomacy? Because we as a human race have become smarter and better at fighting war. But we haven't become smarter and better at fighting for peace. We have tried multiple formulae. They don't work as well. We live in a world today where warfare is taking newer forms. You have drone wars, you have artificial intelligence wars, you have chip wars, but having the solutions for them is something that we haven't been able to do, and that is what requires the Kaizen. That is what requires strong effort and deep effort on the part of not just the diplomats, but of societies and of countries. So the solutions and the diplomatic solutions do not come easy. There are baby steps to be taken. There are negotiations to be done. It is easy to get into a war. We're much smarter at doing that because that can be sudden. But the peace will take the world a long time to get there. And I think that is the central point of this conversation. And that is the central point for the generation of listeners that you are represented here through your working life in the next 3 decades. The challenge will not be to develop the better instruments of warfare or better instruments of accumulating power, but perhaps to develop the better instruments for coexistence through a diplomacy that gets countries to work with each other rather than against each other. So that is really the short point I wanted to make to you. The Kaizen of geopolitics is diplomacy. It is working slowly towards the objective of bringing peace. And let me end with a couple of thoughts of the world we live in today. Because we live in a world now of at least 2 major hot wars. There is the Ukraine war, there is the Gaza war. The efforts over the last few months we've seen in these wars have been to escalate the war, to get each country trying to get what they call escalation dominance, to be able to outwit the other. But in 2025, which hopefully will be the year of ceasefire and peace agreements in these wars, the attempt will have to be to get to the hard diplomacy, the hard conversations. There will still be the use of power, but to work towards a coexistence that gets us to a point where countries will learn to coexist and countries would learn to live in peace without taking millions of lives. So hopefully, the 21st century will be a time when the Kaizen and the small steps would be towards peace building, towards diplomacy, rather than getting better and better at war. Thank you very much.